Okay. I think we're live. Seems that way. Although I can't monitor on YouTube, which is a bit strange, but there you go. Okay, so I wanted to go through an example that I'd already created before. There's actually some things I'm kind of curious about. And I thought this might make a sort of decent example to start looking at the motion design system. So I've loaded up Unreal Engine, I've created a scene in Motion Designer, and I'll take you through the parts of it, just so you kind of understand. But one thing to note here is that it's got, let's just move this around a little bit, it's got a camera cuts track, which is in the sequencer, and it's also got an audio track. So basically I've used a AI generated audio thing, and I was just looking at how to record the simulation. So basically the sort of Niagara system that it creates into a motion design, a sequencer track that you can then render in Movie Render Queue. And it turns out that that didn't work for some reason. So that's something to have a look at. But ultimately what I'm interested in right now is just making sure that we can play the correct sequences and things, because the main thing for a live broadcast is that you create a set of labeled sequences and then have the transition logic here actually enable and disable them for a live broadcast. So there's quite a lot of things to look at still, but let's go through the setup first off. So essentially I've got an audio sequence, and if I play it, so you see that there's some relationship between the audio and the particle system. And so that's the first thing to have a look at. So the cloner itself, the thing that creates these green, items, they're basically little cubes. And the thing that creates them is this cloner system. So essentially if you, that's interesting. It's because we're in selection mode, that's why. If you go to the motion design mode, you get back this panel. If you go to actors and cloner and just drag one of those out into the world, you get a cloner. So the cloner is the thing that creates particles, essentially. In this particular case, it's creating a mesh particle system that's going to render these default cubes. And the default cubes, I've created a new, if we come to the content browser and look for that material, for some reason my PC's not happy with looking up files and stuff right now, so it might take a while sometimes. That particular material instance is just glowing green emissive. So if we look at the material itself, I might be running out of disk space on this machine. That's entirely possible. So this is the material instance. You can see it's just got an emissive brightness value here, right? The light color is, in fact, let's go to its parent and just open that one up. I'll show you the shader, or rather the material. I can't remember whether I actually created this myself or used Material Designer for it, but you can basically see that it's just using a color value multiplied by some detailed texture thing. I'm guessing I didn't create this. I'm guessing this is Material Designer version. And then you just got light brightness. So you can look up all of these things yourself, But essentially, material instance just provides us with a chance to... Oh, actually, it has got like little dots on it. That's interesting. Well, colour me surprised. So yeah, that's really interesting. So, what happens if we... I don't know whether it's meant to be smaller. Oh yeah, it is. Interesting. Let's try Note 1. Yeah, I definitely didn't create this one by hand then. Why has that gone away? 5. Well, you see there's a pattern on there, right? Like, this is obviously the pattern generator thing here. But I'm just interested in the solid colour, really. So let's just put that back to, what was it, 8? So you should get like tiny little dots, but you won't be able to see it because it's so emissive. Yeah, no, I usually stream on Twitch, but I figured I'd use YouTube this time around just to test it out. So you see that there's basically a default cube. When you create a cloner, it'll create a default cube. So I've just literally created a material design, a material with high emissive green, essentially, to give it a bit of glowing, you know. So that's the thing that's actually spawning the particles, and I'll take you through the parameters on that in a second. But the thing that's actually, let's go back to the sequencer, the thing that's actually controlling them, that's like making them move essentially, is this effector. And the effector is essentially the thing that's going to impact the properties of the particles on the cloner. So the cloner itself has got a bunch of possibilities for animation and input and things, but then generally speaking, for the motion design mode, it's the effectors that actually impact the cloner's clones, which is a thing that they've copied from Cinema 4D. So this idea of cloners and effectors is a thing that's like used across the motion graphics industry. So they've stolen some of the basic principles. But you can also see on here, it's got some, like, these little icons suggest that there's something impacting the default values, something that's like animating them or has some property that's changing. And we get that from the operator stack for the object. So essentially, if we select an object in the outliner, so there's a motion designer outliner, this is kind of confusing, right? There's the normal outliner and there's the motion design outliner. So it basically filters out things that it wants to be able to sort of control. And so it can show you these properties on the right-hand side here. And so usually it's something in either the animators or the modifiers. And if we look at the modifiers, it's kind of modifying behavior, generally for things like doing booleans and that kind of thing. So if you imagine you want to cut one shape out of another, that's where you would add a modifier. But for this particular one, I'm using animators. And the animators are, like if we look at the different types of ones, the animators are essentially bits of code that impact the effector. And that's the thing that's very weird to me, is that it's actually, if we say we want this thing to bounce, it's actually bouncing the effector and not the particles. So just be aware that like when you look at an effect, I expected that these things would actually change the position of the particles. So if I wanted the particles to bounce, I was thinking I'll just put a bounce to the location. But that's not correct. What that's actually doing is bouncing the effector. So the effector is a thing that's in the world that has like physical properties, things like radiuses and that kind of stuff, and you'll see the properties down here. So the effector is like a physical location that then impacts the properties of the cloner, but in relation to itself. So basically it's got like a fall-off curve. So as the effector moves through space, it impacts the cloner. But the operators that we apply to the effector impact the effector as well. So like essentially they're moving the effector around. You can bounce the effector's position and then apply that effector to the cloner's particles to affect the cloner's particle position. It's a very weird system, frankly. So anyway, the one that I'm applying here is this sound wave. And the sound wave essentially is going to take the audio track that I'm using here, right? So it's basically using the same WAV file, or MP3 file, I think in this case. And it's sampling that value. And we've linked some of the parameters of the cloner to that effector. So essentially the effector is applying some parameters to the cloner, and you see that I've done curl noise force strength, so basically how much curl noise is being applied to the particles, and curl noise force frequency, so how granular the curl noise force is. So if we look at the actual cloner, you'll see that there's a curl noise force strength property on here, somewhere down. Curl noise force. Wish it wouldn't do that. Where are we? Where is it? Oh, it actually could be on a property of the effector. Let's have a look. Is it on the effector instead? Yes, it is. So essentially that animator is taking in the incoming audio and it's applying that incoming audio's essentially what it's doing is it's taking like an average of the magnitude of the audio input buffer. So it's not really doing an awful lot of analysis on the audio. It's just saying like, how loud are you? And it's applying that loudness to this curl noise force strength. So the curl noise force strength on the effector is the thing that's going to affect the particles on the cloner. Now, I would have probably thought that these things would actually be on the cloner itself, but, you know, that's not how they've worked it out. So the cloner and the effector are the things that work in common. So if you notice on the cloner, I've also got a sound wave animator. And in this particular case, I actually was just testing things out. And what I noticed was that I linked the spawn rate property. So the spawn rate property on the cloner is how many particles are being spawned at a time. So I set the spawn on the cloner, so the thing that's cloning these little green boxes, I've set it to essentially loop forever with a 1 second interval. So basically keep emitting forever every 1 second, use a spawn rate, and then the rate is 19,000 here. So basically spawn 19,000 particles every second. And I initially tried setting this spawn rate in the animator for the cloner, and what that ended up doing was essentially resetting it every time. So one thing that you kind of want to understand here is that this spawn rate value is how would I say it? It's kind of fixed in Niagara. So this, remember, this is all using a Niagara particle system underneath it. And I think what's happening is that if you change this value in real time, it literally resets the Niagara simulation. So it resets the Niagara system. And so what that means is that if you try and animate the spawn rate, none of it functions correctly because it's literally resetting the Niagara simulation every time you touch that variable. And I assume that's because it wants to auto-calculate how many particles it has to deal with. And if you reset that value, it's kind of recalculating how much buffer space to apply to the particle simulation. Which is a bit of a pain because I wanted to animate it so that you had more particles. Yes, it should be archived on YouTube. The YouTube things, I think it deletes it after 30 days or something. But I can always download it and then upload it to Panopto and put it on there if we need to. So you kind of, you have to explore these features, right? You have to explore the different setups just to see where the limitations are. And that's one I came across, was that, like, you can't change this value in real time. You can modify it. And actually, I should probably try doing it as an animated property. But what I came across was the concept that I think that needs to be fixed for the lifetime of the cloner. So essentially, you can set it and run, and it'll be fine. But if you modify it while it's running, it resets the simulation. Now, I might be wrong there, like I'm just sort of assuming that that's the case because I tried doing it, and that's what I saw, right? Is I saw that the animation kind of restarted every time, right? So the things that I expected to happen, like I expected a pulse of particles because I was impacting the clone rate based on the volume of the audio. So I thought, like, as the audio got louder, more particles would emit, but that didn't turn out to be the case. So try it for yourselves. You might have a different perspective on what's going on with it, but that's my assumption anyway. So let's just go through. So you can drag a cloner out into the world, and once you've got a cloner in here, the way to get an emitter, one of the easiest ways at least, is that you come to the spawn linked emitter. So that's what I did, right? I spawned a linked emitter, which essentially fills in this effectors array. Sorry, spawn linked effector, not emitter. So essentially what you do is you can spawn like multiple effectors, and the effectors are the things that are meant to kind of control some property of spatial characteristics. So it could be that you have one effector that's like maybe scaling things up and another effector that's making them move around, and you can have like different properties on different effectors. And the thing that you should sort of think about when you're doing these designs is that the effector can be added to this sequence. And so the sequence is the thing that's actually, let me just drag this here. The sequencer is a standard thing in Unreal Engine where you can kind of control an animation. And the idea here would be that you set up a bunch of sequences, and you'll see there's the sequence kind of outline here. This is all motion designer added stuff. So by default, sequencer exists in Unreal Engine to capture things into like movies. But this particular setup is built into motion designer. And essentially what it does is it bakes into all of this data into a particular level. And one thing I've heard of on the sort of forums at Epic was that some people, they didn't know how to get rid of motion designer mode once it's added to their level, and that's because motion designer bakes these sequences into the level data. Whereas by default in Unreal Engine, when you add a sequencer, it's actually created as a thing in the outliner. But that's not the same in motion design mode. So just be aware of that. Like these things are, data assets are different. So normally your sequencer sequences would be data assets, but in this particular case, they're baked into the level asset, which is very strange. And I'm not entirely sure why they would change that paradigm, but they did. So anyway, couple of other things. So you see that I've like animated some properties of the camera, focal lengths and stuff like that. I don't actually think I've added any key values in there. It's just by default, when you add a camera, it's probably creating some of these tracks. I added the audio file into this audio track. So basically you just drag an asset into the sequencer and it'll create a track for it. The one thing I did do, or at least I tried to do, was simulate the Niagara system for this particular subset of the animation. So if we just play the animation for a second. What I was trying to get at was like a sort of audio visual simulation-y kind of thing, right? And so what you can do in Niagara is you can tell it to simulate, you can cache out the positions of your particles. And so what I've tried to do is do that here, because when I tried to use the movie render queue to render out this sequence, it didn't show any of the particles. So there's something that you need to do to connect these systems up that I didn't do when I was testing it out. So just be aware that, like, I think it might be a plugin issue. I think this might actually require some extra plugins that I haven't enabled. But you can, like, cache out the Niagara simulation, because these things can be quite expensive to calculate. So you can essentially save it out as a set of data streams and then in sequencer replay those streams. I don't know whether it's because the sequence is slightly different, it has different capabilities than standard, like, Unreal Engine sequencer or not. Not entirely sure. But the point is that you can kind of create these cloners, create these effectors, and, you know, you can add these objects into your sequence and then animate their properties. So essentially, you can just grab a property of a thing, right? So in this case, the effector, we can say, if we want to key, whether it's enabled or not, we would just press that add keyframe and it will take the keyframe at the current position of your, you know, your, what's this called? Jesus. The handle, right? So where you are in your current frame. And it's pretty much the same kind of thing if you want to control it remote control wise. So again, remote control, the movie render queue, the sequencer is all built into the motion design mode. So you can do a remote control property. You can also keyframe it from a sequence. And that's an interesting sort of thing, right? So it might be that we have some things that are remote controlled and some things that are animated and stored in a sequence, and we play the sequence maybe from a trigger via the remote control system. So it's a collection of systems, really. A lot of this stuff kind of, like the sequencer thing and the remote control, obviously existed in Unreal Engine before. What's new in this motion design mode is kind of like A, the user interface, and B, the cloner and effector system. What I will say is that I've noticed from some like live streams recently from Epic is that they're adding quite a lot of functionality to this system over the next few releases of Unreal Engine, and I suspect that that's because it's not really very well fleshed out yet what you can do with it. So you see that, like, if you look on tutorials on YouTube, you get a lot of very similar things because it's quite a limited system currently. And I would say the same thing for the PCG system as well, is that there's a lot of changes coming for both of them that actually make interesting looking visuals possible using a bunch of different systems at the same time. Okay, so, you know, I've basically, the actual scene itself is just, if I remember rightly, there should be like a cube for the floor. There's a sphere for the sphere in the center, and it's got this, like just a I think it's a stock material. It might be come from the material pack or something, you know, something I downloaded from the marketplace or something I got from Quixel. But the point is that it was just an example, right? I was trying to create an example of this cloner doing some kind of audio thing. So again, you can add your own, right? So let's just do that for now. We can spawn a new linked effector. Our second effector, you see that it's got this kind of radius thing in it. So essentially you can also control like the wire thickness and well, if you want to be able to see it a bit clearer. You can control how this effector impacts the things near it. So in this particular case, it's created a sphere effector with a linear fall off, and it's got an inner and outer radius. So that inner and outer radius is like how strong it's going to apply its effect. And the mode itself, it can have, you know, different modes that you can probably try out for this thing. But what it's actually doing is it's applying forces, and this is where the real meat of it comes in, right? If we wanted to apply an orientation force, for instance, what you'll find is there's a bunch of example kind of tutorials on this orientation force, allowing you to essentially control the orientation of a cloner, like a cloner's content. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just we'll create a new level, and we'll have a look at we'll not save that for now. My PC is being incredibly slow at loading stuff today, so I think I might be running out of disk space on my general drive. So this is one of their examples, if I remember rightly, and yeah. So you'll see that, like when you enable the motion design plugin, you'll get some of these examples as well. And so we can kind of look at what all's happening with these. You'll see that the effectors affect things in space. So again, inner radius, outer radius, and what you would do is you would typically animate these effectors. You'd maybe, you know, you'd drag these effectors into your sequence and then just animate them with keyframing like you would in any other sort of keyframe package. But they're working all the time, right? So that's one thing that's like fundamentally different, is that these things are always enabled unless you disable them, right? So there's an enabled property that you can animate. You can disable it. So let's do that. We've got it enabled now. We switch it off and keyframe it again. Switch it, go for a bit further on, switch it on, keyframe it again. You get the point, right? Like, it's basically just an animation system. Now that is not a great animation, so let's delete that. So essentially, all you're doing is you're kind of like keyframing properties on effectors and cloners, essentially. So let's have a look at the other one. The other one's basically moving the object through space. So one's applying, I think it's a scale. It looks like it's doing some kind of scaling thing, right? Oh, it's applying a noise and a scale. So if we wanted to sort of change how it looks, we can just change the scale property on this. I'll set it back. So you can set things back with this little reset property value, but of course it's going to reset to 1 because that's the default value for a scale. And so what essentially is happening here is that it's applying a noise field inside its boundaries and animating a bunch of these different values with that noise. So the first effector is essentially pulling the cubes around. So the cloner's essentially done this, this particular cloner is just spawning things on a grid. Actually, has that got an animator on it? Let's have a look. Yeah, so it's doing a rotation over time. So again, you could just add animators, right? You can do, so it's gonna like animate the rotation over time. You could make it bounce as well. So you could bounce the rotation if you wanted to. You could pulse it in and out, that kind of thing. So the animators are essentially modifiers placed on the objects. And modifiers are the same thing, but they generally affect behavior or mesh, whereas these things just animate properties, right? So essentially these are just data transformation things. And so what we will do is we'll take these things and we'll move them through space, right? We tend to think of these like effectors as like spatial distortions in a way, spatial transformations. And that means, you can get really interesting real-time effects out of it. So in this particular case, again, it's applying a noise field, and that's affecting the location. So if we just set that up a bit higher as well, you can see that it applies to the things inside itself, but not outside. So if we wanted to animate a thing falling apart, for instance, we would make an effector that makes things apply gravity, for instance. There is a sort of gravity value that you can change. And what you would do is you would animate it. But here's the thing, right? It doesn't have to be a spherical object. It could be a plane. So what's actually happening is that the plane applies when you cross one side to the other. So again, it's got the inside and outside fall off kind of thing, but you can apply a planar distortion that passes through space as some kind of planar property. And if you think about, if you wanted to do something like a growth simulation, it's often useful to apply a planar growth value, in space. So these are kind of spatial distortion things. And you've got boxes where it'll just do it inside the box, obviously. So you can kind of see the effect here. When something is inside the box, it's being affected. When it's outside the box, it's not. So similar to the sort of sphere thing. And obviously you can apply different types of fall-off effect for that. And then unbound basically just affects everything. So you probably want to usually have some kind of spatial control over it all. Does that make sense? So basically the effectors are the things that are going to control the clones. The cloner is the thing that's making the cubes. In this particular case, it's making 2 cubes, which is interesting. Oh, it's making 2 cubes because it wants different colors on them. So, and it's using material slots on the cubes, which is like a material designer thing. I haven't looked at material designer too much because I like doing my shaders by hand, my materials. So I tend not to use them like material designer. And they're going to change the material designer in the next release. I saw a video last week where they kind of showed a completely different material designer setup, and I think it looks a lot better in the next version. So I'm not going to focus too much on that. And then you've got your typical sort of lighting setup and your props for like, the background and the psych and that kind of stuff. And then you've got your properties for your camera. So again, you can animate all of these properties, right? These things are all available for you to change. You see, we can keyframe all of it. So we could animate the camera doing different transitions and movements while we also animate the effectors and the cloner. So it's a very dynamic setup, and obviously the main thing here is that, like, it's up to you to choose what the effect you want should look like. You know, ultimately, because it's dynamic, because it's real time, you can get a really broad range of different effects, even with these relatively simple setups. Once they start adding more functionality to this system, I expect it to, you know, get a lot more impactful. So let's just change the outer radius of this for a second. I expect this system to get a lot more user-friendly, I suppose, but also a lot more powerful in terms of what you can do with geometry. Remember, we're limited by the fact that it's a Niagara system, so they are just particles in reality. They're not physics-based objects. They're not doing kind of interaction, and there's no logic associated with them. But I suspect that what they'll do is they'll start incorporating some of the more, like, Niagara stuff. So Niagara particles can have physics, sort of, like a simplistic physics system applied to them, so they can fall with gravity and hit a floor. And I suspect that the next few releases of Motion Designer will enable that kind of thing. One of the effectors I saw that they added in the next release is an effector that pushes things away from the central location. So they'll kind of make it so that you can push these particles or attract them in the next release, whereas currently you can't really do that. I mean, you can sort of, there's like vortex forces and curl noise forces and orientation forces and stuff. So essentially they're going to build in a bunch more kind of force values into this system. But looking at the code for it, because it is Niagara based, they are somewhat limited, and I hope what they're doing eventually is have some kind of blueprintable or some kind of graph that you can edit, that you can actually make your own versions of these things, because it feels like that's one of the things that's missing. And in many ways, they did the same thing with the PCG system. When they first brought out the first release, it was quite limited, but over time they made it so you could make your own, like, PCG graph nodes and stuff. And I think that that's what they'll do with this system, is that they'll make it user editable in more meaningful ways. Right now, they're just trying to cater for motion graphics artists, right? So they want, like, they want existing systems that do something similar to what they're already used to. Whereas I think the reality is that eventually we'll get a lot more programmability and maybe some kind of graph editor for it all. But, you know, I think it's still a usable system even now. It's just a matter of using your imagination and how you will achieve the effects you want. So are there any questions now? Just things that you're kind of curious about that we can have a look at? I mean, we can just sort of freeform a few different things if you want. Let's add a scale oscillator. So again, this is all like a stack of transforms. So I just changed this oscillate thing, right? We can change the magnitude of it. We can change how often it does it, make it a bit slower. I might have gone a little bit mad there. Well, let's put it back to 1. Now there's interesting. I would have thought that magnitude would have a minimum and maximum, not just an upper value. It's these kind of things that annoy me, really. I want to be able to control how small it gets as well as how big. So, yeah, let's just set that back to something a little bit more reasonable. The other thing is that when you create these animators, you tell it which properties are going to be animated. So we can change. You could switch off, like, different values, or we can add new ones. So we can say, let's try the visibility track. Be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? So all they're doing is they're taking like the global time, and you can change the time to come from the sequence value here, or just keep it in world time. But the linked properties are the things that are kind of like, so essentially you can just switch off parts of it. And again, all of these properties come with some different things. So see, like they've got min-max there, but they don't do it for scale, for the oscillation. It's weird. Don't like that visibility thing. Let's bin that off. So ultimately, it's about figuring out which properties you want to change and how the change works. So let's put that up to something a little bit more reasonable. It's more like it. But it is relatively a usable system. And if you want to delete any of these animators, you can just delete them here or switch them off. So let's just disable all of them for now. So you notice that these things are still moving, and that's because the effectors are still within range to do that. So like, even if we switch off the animators on the cloner, the effectors are still impacting them. Can you edit lighting in this way? Yeah. So again, like we took our lights. Let's find one that's like close. Again, we can. That's actually a good question. Can we add animators on the lights? Let's try it. Let's bounce the location. Yes, we can. I mean, it's a bit weird, but let's switch off the bounce on one of the. There we go. Let's do this. And then we can change the values. There we go. Try that. Yeah, so, I think it will basically animate anything that shows up in the motion designer. I don't know whether it'll actually allow you to do just random things. I guess it probably will do. Skylight. Will that show up in the operator stack? Let's make it visible. Oscillate the visibility of the skylight. Yep. Okay. It's getting a bit crazy now, isn't it? Let's just delete that. What was that? It was the rect fill. You can see that the things that are being animated, right, have these little icons, and you can just double click them to go to your stack, or you could double click them. That was weird. Took a while to get there. So don't like that bounce. Let's just get rid of it. Why is that not deleting it? This should delete that, so maybe there's a bug there. I mean, just leave it switched off there. Oh, maybe because I didn't have that. Ooh. No. Oh, of course, it doesn't have any. That's weird. I think the user interface just took a while to clean itself up. Again, this is an experimental tool set, so you will probably come across problems. Yeah, so what you would probably do, so the thing that's maybe not obvious, let's see if I can, well, that's weird. In the world, right, this stuff is just a bunch of objects. So when you switch off motion design, usually motion design mode will like switch all of this stuff off if you exit out of it, but for some reason the interface is screwed up in this particular level. But it leaves all the assets, right? All of the assets are still in your scene. So the things that have been animated and the animations on the cloner and stuff still work. So what I would probably do is I would try out a player character as a sort of source for input. But you can always just essentially parent an effector under a character. So like the effector itself could impact the cloner, but be parented to a character. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've seen a video stream where somebody did exactly that. We'll try it out on Wednesday if you want, just to see if it works, but I'm pretty sure it will, because they're literally just objects in the scene, essentially, right? So, you know, you can kind of move them by hand. Well, why wouldn't you be able to move them with a character? And so when you click play, they are still working, right? They are just things that are like live in the engine. So there's no reason other than the fact that it's in motion design mode that disables that. And what I'm kind of curious about is essentially using a mixture of different types of things. One sec. Using a mixture of different types of systems, so things like skeletal animations and stuff, Niagara systems, PCG systems, all of these things together, but then using motion design mode, like motion design, was it that one? It wasn't that one. Cam 35, yeah. Using motion design mode to actually capture it. So essentially the motion design sort of setup is just a scene in Unreal Engine, but it's built for like capturing these kind of real-time visuals. So the things that you can do that are probably a little bit different than normal is that you can create these like 2D shapes. So for example, they do essentially screen align 2D shapes that you can then modify and do different things in, like so changing the number of points and stuff. You can also extrude these 2D shapes into 3D shapes. So where are we? It might be it's a modifier. That's what it is. That's why. So once you've got your 2D shape, you can add a modifier, and you can do an extrude modifier on that shape, and now it becomes a 3D shape. So if we just stop piloting the camera for a second, you see they changed from a screen aligned 2D shape into a 3D shape. And then again, for their modifiers, we can have a, let's just make sure we've selected that thing. We can add a bevel modifier and make it more, so that was the extrusion. This is the bevel. put that to like 3, make it a bit softer, inset a little bit more. So you can make these like shapes into, you know, more interesting looking content. I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but you can do things like text and, you know, other types of shapes. One of the ones that is interesting to me, if we just go back to our camera, where are we? I might have moved the camera now. Let's pilot Chem 35. Yeah, okay. You can make a rectangle, and the rectangle itself has got these little dots on it. And these little dots allow you to control how rounded the edges are. That's weird. So you'll see that actually I'm having a problem controlling it. You can do manipulations to the objects. I think it's because I've messed up the camera a little bit. Oh, wow. Yeah. A 35mm camera is not the best thing to be able to sort of control. So you see that you basically got some like objects that you can manipulate, you can change their properties of. Obviously, these things you would apply a bunch of materials and stuff. Where are we? You would use the motion, not the motion, the material designer usually to actually make these things have like a better material value on them. Might be on here actually, yeah. Create with material designer and design some actual materials for them. But that, I mean, like these things, as far as I can kind of tell, there aren't an awful lot of. So there's a text actor that you can drag in. Oh, maybe I think you need to click them twice to get them in there. And so we can take our text actor and we can say, and again, these things are editable. You know, they're animatable and stuff. And you can do, you know, all of the modifiers again. You can, did I select it? Yes, I did. I think we need to convert this to a mesh first and then add another modifier for like extrude and then bevel. Ooh, that bevel didn't go very well, did it? Maybe extruded it a bit too far. Let's extrude it 10, bevel it 0.3. It could be the actual font itself is not great. And again, because it's doing this dynamically, you can convert that into a mesh and then do the stuff on top of it. In fact, we might want to do that. Convert to a static mesh and save it somewhere. Okay, you have to be careful with these things, you know. It's just, let's delete all of that stuff. I wonder if we change the font. I think the font is like important when you're doing those modifications. I noticed that it doesn't like, you know, the shapes need to be kind of relatively chunky, I think, for those modifiers to work very well. So let's just try that again. Dynamic mesh. So this is essentially changing that into a what they call a dynamic mesh in Unreal Engine, which is this thing that you can then use geometry script and stuff on. So it's under the hood. All of these things are using geometry script to actually do the manipulation. So the extrude modifier. Actually, it looks like it's not creating the sides properly here, which is strange. You can look into this thing yourself, right? You can see what all of that actually means. Front, symmetrical. Do we want to close the back? Yeah, we probably do. So one of the properties I'm adding on here is obviously hide converted mesh. Okay. Anyway, I'm not going to worry about that too much. You can always play with it. And then if we try and bevel it, obviously it's going to fall apart because it's not actually extruding the sides properly. I did try this the other day and it worked fine, so it's just it's a matter of finding the correct mixture of operations. But theoretically, right, this extrude should generate us, as we add them, the extrude should be able to extrude the sides of this thing. And it is on some of them. Like if you look at the eye here, it's kind of extruding it fine. But other shapes, it's not. So I suspect that there's some property on the actual text that it's using. In fact, let's try that. It could just be the font that doesn't allow itself to be extruded properly. It's interesting, it didn't apply the operator stack. Well, anyway, I'll let you play with that. They did do a pretty good run through of all of these operations, by the way, on their YouTube channel. So it's probably worth just having a quick nosy at that. But I think, you know, as it stands, it's a usable system, but I wouldn't say it was great yet. But for the most part, it's kind of, you know, it's capable of doing some interesting looking things. What else can it do? Null actors are just placeholders for like things in space. Media play is so you can play a video. One of the interesting bits is this SVG actor. Now, I don't actually have an SVG file to show you, but essentially the SVG actor, if we just move this star out of the way, the SVG actor can take in an input SVG set of curves and make a mesh out of them. So then you can like extrude it like we did with, you know, these things, right? You can do the same kind of operations on an arbitrary set of like image curves. So SVGs are used a lot for like not just fonts and stuff, but for like illustrations in vector graphics. And so you can actually import these vector graphics files, and there's loads of them on the internet, so I would suggest you have a look at that. Import them as shapes and use them as kind of logos and things like that, but then transform them into 3D like we did with the operator stack, right? We can add a modifier on here and do all of the sort of booleans and bevels and those kind of things. In fact, let's just do a bevel on there. Oh, we can't do a bevel yet. We haven't got an extrude. So let's extrude it. Well, that's interesting. It's not got an extrude. I think we might need to import a file first then. and then do like extrude and what have you. Interesting. So you can see these operations, right? These are all operations from the geometry script kind of interruption, like, so the kind of things that you would expect to be able to do, like Boolean things out of each other and mirror and all of that kind of thing. So try them out. This is the point where you kind of just need to experiment with it all, right? I would have a look at the media plate. Like by default, it won't have anything on it, but again, you can sort of choose. It's actually chosen the SVG again for some reason. Select the media plate and choose a media material. Basically, you can play a video image on a material and then use that material on a media plate, so you can have like animated video in the background for your scenes. We use a lot in like TV broadcasts, for instance, to bring in live external video and stuff, or to like have, I don't know, a newsreel kind of background plate running and that kind of thing. So again, lights, typical stuff. One thing that you want to have a look at is this create defaults. So when you create a new scene, you can create the default lighting setup and the default setup it needs for Motion Designer to work. And there's a bunch of like camera operation stuff. So things like setting up a camera dolly track and having your camera kind of go up and down and animating all of your camera tracks and those kind of things. This is more of the sort of virtual production side of this. What I'm kind of more interested in is like creating the motion graphics themselves to start off with. Why did I create 2 plates? That's a bit weird. So have a look at that SVG actor for like logos and whatever. It's pretty cool. Where's my star? Get rid of my star and my rectangle. So you'll find this example, I think it's enabled when you enable the plugin, but you might need to, if you come to the content browser area, you might need to go to settings and then show plugin content here. You might need to tick that one on before you can find it. But it appeared when I enabled that, I think. So this particular example is one of the ones that I think is inside the plugin. So you might want to have a go and look at that level and play with it and steal some of its kind of, some of its setup stuff, things like the lights and what have you. Okay, so I'm going to end the stream here. We'll have another one maybe later on in this, like later on in the year. I'm hopeful that we'll get Unreal Engine 5.5 dropping in the next few weeks, in which case we might look at like what's new in that and see if there's any significant additions to this system that we can use for our assessments. But that'll do us for now. Thanks for joining, or thanks for watching later on, and we'll have a discussion next week on some new topics in the graphics area, things like skeletal animation. We'll start looking at control rigs and things like that. And I do want to get to the point where we've got Niagara systems rendering in our Motion Designer scenes. So we'll have a look at doing a Niagara system on a skeleton as a setup, because I think that that's an important thing for us to be able to do. And I've tried it a couple of times before, but I don't remember it. So we'll go through the setup for that as well. But we need to get the end display stuff set up as well, before next week. Okay, I'm going to stop the stream there, and I shall chat to you later. Again, just play with this thing, right? It's a tool that we're meant to like explore a little bit, I think. And then we'll actually look at making sure that the remote control and all of that kind of other stuff is available to us, and probably have a look at how we, how we store these sequences out and play them back and time them so that we can do one sequence after another and that kind of thing. Okay, guys, see you later.